2 years after the invasion of Iraq, protesters take to the streets once again. We are live at a rally in Trafalgar Square.
But life in the shattered nation is anything but normal.
Clark reviews the Cannabis Laws, a serious response to health concerns or a preemptive pre-election strike.
Killer's appeal. Was witness protection taken too far in the Birmingham Shooting trial?
Wales go for Grand Slam glory, but Ireland send in their way at the Millennium Stadium.
And Arsenal go above Man United after beating Blackburn in the Premiership.
Sky News with Alan King and Vivian Krieger.
Good afternoon. Where once hundreds of thousands gathered to protest, today just a fraction of that number have taken to Britain's streets to demonstrate against the war in Iraq.
On the second anniversary of the US-led invasion, anti-war campaigners gathered for a march through central London, and they also rallied in Glasgow.
Similar events have been staged around the world, but the turnout isn't expected to be anything like the global protest in the run-up to conflict. Well, police say in London around 45,000 turned out for the rally. Sky's Ashish Joshi joined us now from Trafalgar Square. Ashish.
Alan, we still don't know exactly how many people have attended this march. The organisers are very pleased with the turnout. They say it's somewhere in the region of 100,000, but some of the police I've spoken to a little earlier put the figure as low as 20,000. But the organisers say that's missing their point. They don't want to get into a number-crunching game. They say it doesn't matter how many people actually turned out, and the fact that it's nowhere near the figure that we saw last year and the year before, they say that misses the point completely. Iraq is still an issue for these people 2 years on, and that is the message they're trying to get across, especially now in the few weeks running up to what we think is going to be a general election.
And Ashish, as far as the crowd's concerned, as you say, far fewer people. Nevertheless, the fact that 2 years on, people are still prepared to organise such protests must show the strength of feeling.
That's right, and don't forget, Alan, these protests aren't just taking place here, they're taking place right across the world, in capital cities across Europe, across America. There have been 11 organised marches by the Stop the War coalition, and each one remains as popular. Yes, of course, the figures do diminish slightly, but that doesn't take away the importance of the message. The banners have changed slightly, of course, as they would. Now it's all about bring our boys home, end the occupation. And the chief thing here is they want to keep Iraq well up there in the political agenda. That's the real message today.
Indeed. And what is the mood of the people, those you've spoken to? How are they feeling, not only about the war, obviously those feelings are clear, but about the diminishing number, the diminishing response of those who felt so vehemently against it?
Well, they say that the feeling is as high as it was 2 years ago. The fact that there aren't as many people here today doesn't take anything away from that. I mean, you know, there's a party atmosphere here today. There are bands playing and there are drums and there's a sound system. So there are lots of young people. It is a carnival atmosphere, and there are lots of flowers being distributed and the placards, and it's generally very peaceful. But that doesn't take away, of course, the seriousness of the message today. There are hundreds and hundreds of groups all brought together under this coalition, under the Stop the War banner. But now the message has changed. They've become a little more politically aware of how important it is to get their message and these pictures flashed across into homes across Britain, because the crucial thing is now, of course, the timing. With an election just a few weeks away, if it's called, of course, that's what they want to do. They want to keep the message right up there in the political agenda, and they feel that they are actually doing that today.
And as you say, good weather, peaceful day as far as they're concerned. What about police presence and police reaction, Ashish?
The police presence has been very low profile. They are here. There are hundreds and hundreds of police officers everywhere, but they're keeping the distance. They're standing well back, and you know, the barricades have been erected. They've been talking to the march organisers. Neither side wants any trouble, because I mean that would send out the wrong signal, of course, for the Stop the War coalition. The police are standing well back, but they are here in their numbers, but you don't see them unless you actually look for them. They're keeping a discreet presence away from the main march. They're shepherding the march along, nudging it along into the routes that were designed to take place weeks and months in advance when this was all put together.
Of course, the language George Bush used towards Iraq before the invasion, he is now replicating in the case of Iran. Have people there said anything about their fears on that front?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying. apart from the election issue, now what they're worried about is, of course, Syria and Iran. You know, the people you speak to today are very, very politically aware of what's going on in America, what's being said by George Bush, and they're saying, okay, look, there has been action taken in Iraq, and our protests didn't stop that, but we did send out a clear message to the British government. And what they're saying now is that they're scared. They're scared now that this invasion of Iraq took place 2 years ago, and of course, Iran and Syria feature so prominently in Washington's rhetoric.
Ashish Joshi there live for us in Trafalgar Square. Ashish, thanks very much indeed for that.
Well, let's now cross live to America, where President Bush is giving his weekly radio address. This comes just as the news is announced that the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has been invited to George W. Bush's Texas ranch on the 11th of April. That announcement came from the White House. They will, of course, discuss the Middle East peace process and the war on terrorism. But let's see what George Bush has got to say today. Coming up in a moment, we're sure.
Operation Iraqi Freedom to disarm a brutal regime, free its people, and defend the world from a grave danger. Before coalition forces arrived, Iraq was ruled by a dictatorship that murdered its own citizens, threatened its neighbors, and defied the world. We knew of Saddam Hussein's record of aggression and support for terror. We knew of his long history of pursuing, even using, weapons of mass destruction. And we know that September the 11th requires our country to think differently. We must and we will confront threats to America before they fully materialize. Now, because we acted, Iraq's government is no longer a threat to the world or its own people. Today, the Iraqi people are taking charge of their own destiny. In January, over 8 million Iraqis defied the car bombers and assassins to vote in free elections. This week, Iraq's Transitional National Assembly convened for the first time. These elected leaders broadly represent Iraq's people and include more than 85 women. They will now draft a new constitution for a free and democratic Iraq. In October, that document will be presented to the Iraqi people in a national referendum. Another election is planned for December to choose a permanent constitutional government. Free governments reflect the culture of the citizens they serve, and that is happening in Iraq. Today, Iraqis can take pride in building a government that answers to its people and honors their country's unique heritage. Millions of Americans saw that pride in an Iraqi woman named Safiya Taleb al-Suhail, who sat in the gallery during the State of the Union address. 11 years ago, Saddam Hussein's thugs murdered her father. Today, Safiya's nation is free, and Saddam Hussein sits in a prison cell. Safiya expressed the gratitude of the Iraqi nation when she embraced the mom of Marine Corps Sergeant Byron Norwood, who was killed in the assault on Fallujah. To all the brave members of our armed forces who have taken part in this historic mission, and to your families, I express the heartfelt thanks of the American people. I know that nothing can end the pain of the families who've lost loved ones in this struggle, but they can know that their sacrifice is added to America's security and the freedom of the world. Iraq's progress toward political freedom has opened a new phase of our work there. We are focusing on our efforts on training the Iraqi security forces. As they become more self-reliant and take on greater security responsibilities, America and its coalition partners will increasingly assume a supporting role. In the end, Iraqis must be able to defend their own country, and we will help that proud new nation secure its liberty, and then our troops will return home with the honor they have earned. Today, we're seeing hopeful signs across the broader Middle East. The victory of freedom in Iraq is strengthening a new ally in the war on terror and inspiring democratic reformers from Beirut to Tehran. Today, women can vote in Afghanistan. Palestinians are breaking the old patterns of violence, and hundreds of thousands of Lebanese are rising up to demand their sovereignty and democratic rights. These are landmark events in the history of freedom. Only the fire of liberty can purge the ideologies of murder by offering hope to those who yearn to live free. The experience of recent years has taught us an important lesson. The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. Because of our actions, freedom is taking root in Iraq, and the American people are more secure. Thank you for listening.
Well, George W. Bush's weekly radio address there, and joining us now is Sudan biographer and scholar of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Simon Henderson. Welcome, Simon. Good to see you, as always. So here we are 2 years on, and it seems the policies, the attitude of Mr. Bush, absolutely unchanged.
Yes, completely unapologetic to what he's done, and completely, frankly, optimistic on what he's achieved and where he's going from here. I couldn't imagine anything more contrary to what is being demonstrated about here in London today, and as you reported, in other capital cities in the world.
You said there, Simon, where he's going from here. Where do you think he is going? What's next on his agenda?
Well, he was very much throwing the story forward. And the story, as he wants to depict it, is the advance of democracy, the advance of political freedom and civil freedom in the Middle East. And he named the Palestinians, what's happening in Lebanon, and he also said that people in Tehran wanted much the same thing as well.
So, do you think that is, you say there's no apology, there's no change of stance there. Is he sufficiently buoyed up, do you think, that he could take some form of military action elsewhere?
He didn't mention military action unless I missed it. So that wasn't the... Well, I think he uses that in reserve, and he didn't have to mention, because people know that he can use it in reserve. But I think what he's saying is, look, as a result of our military action in the past and our continuing hard work and efforts in Afghanistan and in Iraq, people know which side we're on, and they are testing the limits of the authority, the dictatorship, which is holding them back. And that's what we're seeing in Lebanon, and that's what he wants to see elsewhere.
Is there any glimmer, do you think, in his mind of, or understanding of the reason for so much anti-American feeling, that yes, of course, he can have his view of how the world should be, but does he have actually the right to impose that view upon the world down the barrel of a gun?
I don't think he sees it in those terms at all. He's well aware of there's opposition to his policies. You know, Senator Kerry, when he was standing against him in the presidential elections, rehearsed the arguments goodness knows how many times. I mean, and he also hears it diplomatically from his embassies abroad, and no doubt in his political meetings with the like of Tony Blair and others. Except we don't really know what he hears at that stage. And what I'm fairly certain he ignores completely is what the people demonstrating today in London, who are a rainbow coalition, a coalition of pretty well everything, and they're actually, rather perversely, united against whatever the United States wants to do, which puts them, frankly, in a rather obscure position of defending Syria, defending Iran, wanting the troops out of Iraq, so that the Iraqi people can reinstall some government, which will no doubt would, to my mind, no doubt be ghastly. And so President Bush sees that he's been successful, thinks he's on the moral high ground, and looks around to see if somebody is competing for him for the moral high ground, sees the demonstrations as today, and decides there's no competition to him at all.
Simon Henderson, very many thanks as always.
Lawyers for 2 of the 4 men found guilty of murdering 2 Birmingham teenagers may appeal against their convictions, claiming it was one of the most unfair trials of modern times.
The 4 were found guilty yesterday of shooting dead Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare during a New Year party 2 years ago. Unprecedented special measures were put in place to ensure witnesses could testify without fear of reprisal.
The news that those found guilty of murdering the 2 girls are to appeal will cause great distress to the families of Letitia Shakespeare and Charlene Ellis. They had hoped the verdicts would close a chapter on 2 years of tragedy, allowing them to complete the grieving process. But this was always going to be a difficult case to prosecute. Extreme measures had to be taken to protect the few witnesses brave enough to appear in court. The appeal court ruled early in the trial that anonymity should be granted to those willing to testify against gang members who terrorised their community.
Witnesses are the sort of lifeblood of the criminal justice system. In this particular case, they were terrified. Witnesses were terrified for themselves, for their family's safety. and we had to put in place, obviously, a range of measures to protect them. You're aware, obviously, we had screens, we had voice distortion and anonymity, and this case has pushed the boundaries on those legal provisions.
The defendants' lawyers argue this was an unfair trial because some witnesses were allowed to remain anonymous despite having a grievance against the gang members.
The problem is this: you cannot grant anonymous status to a witness who's demonstrated to be a liar and who the prosecution accepted and admitted was involved in gangland activities. We're not talking about the little old lady who witnesses a bank robbery and simply has no axe to grind or any motives for lying. We're talking about someone who had every motive to lie and who, on the prosecution's own admission, had indeed lied.
Nathan Martin, Michael Gregory, Marcus Ellis and Rodrigo Sims will be sentenced for murder on Monday.
Let's get more now from Sky's Ross Appleyard, who's live for us in Birmingham. And yesterday, Ross, the police said that they felt this was a landmark case. Today, it does seem clear that the defence have deeply felt objections.
Yes, it's rather curious this, because once the trial had started there was about 6 weeks of legal argument, and that resulted in the case being referred to the appeal court already, dealing exactly with this issue. Should witnesses be protected? Should they retain anonymity? Particularly if those witnesses were to be discredited in any way. In other words, had they been members of gangs, perhaps rival gangs to the Burger Bar boys whose members were convicted of this murder. So it's rather curious that they're going to appeal on those grounds. It's always open to them, but given that the appeal court on November the 9th last year already turned this down, it's difficult to see where it will go from here.
And it's 2 out of the 4 men at the moment that we believe are going to lodge an appeal.
That's what we've had confirmed, yes. Marcus Ellis and Rodrigo Sims have said that they will appeal. That's what their solicitors have said. Marcus Ellis, of course, being the half-brother of Charlene Ellis, who died in this attack. So that's... We know that the 2 of them will appeal. We're still waiting to hear whether the other 2 will appeal as well. And it could be a long-running legal battle. And it's the last thing, really, that the family want. They felt yesterday, as I spoke to them, that they'd had some closure on this case. Now was the time to begin grieving. They'd had justice, and justice had been seen to be done. That's very important for a family in a situation like this, that they get the guilty verdicts in, they know who's done it, they've seen justice, then they can start the grieving process and close this whole tragic 2 years down. But if it goes to appeal, that 2 years will rumble on and on and on.
Thank you, Ross.
The top stories here on Sky News. On the 2nd anniversary of the US-led invasion of Iraq, anti-war protesters are demonstrating here and abroad. In a radio address, President Bush defended the military action, saying it's opened the way for freedom.
14 months after downgrading cannabis to a Class C drug, the government has ordered a review of the decision. New studies have suggested a link between cannabis use and mental illness.
And lawyers for 2 of the 4 men found guilty of murdering Birmingham teenagers, Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare, are planning an appeal against their convictions. They're claiming an unfair trial after special measures were put in place to encourage witnesses to testify.
The weather